That night, hailstones fell across Ashford Hollow. At the service door behind one of the neighborhood's finest houses, a man stood quietly under the awning, his cheap nylon jacket soaked through, a baseball cap pulled low over most of his face, a torn insulated delivery bag in his hands. He did not knock impatiently. He did not demand anything. He did not ask for anything at all. He only asked whether he might stand there for 10 minutes until the hail let up. When the door opened, Meredith Voss looked at him, not at the shoes coming apart at the soles, not at the ruined jacket, not at any of the things most people use to decide who someone is in a single second. She was a night shift nurse in end-of-life care, and the first thing she saw was his hands. They had already gone blue with cold. "Come inside," she said. "Not 10 minutes. All the way inside." For 5 years, Meredith had lived in that house in a small room above the garage, and not one day of it had ever belonged to her. She held the hands of strangers until their final breath, then came home to a place where no one bothered to say her name. She had no idea that tonight, over a cup of ginger tea and one open door, 5 years of her life would be reduced to a single suitcase, a suitcase, she would soon discover, that someone had already taken down and packed away in advance. And she could never have imagined that the ragged man standing in front of her had not wandered there by accident. He had come to that house for a reason. The reason simply wasn't her. If this story reaches you, leave a like. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it tonight. And subscribe so you don't miss the stories we tell next. The kitchen at the back of the Thorne house was the warmest place in the entire mansion, and it was also the only place Meredith Voss was allowed to think of as her own. She closed the service door behind the man, slid the bolt into place, and at once the sound of hail retreated into the distance, as though it belonged to another world entirely. She pulled a chair away from the small dining table. "Sit down here." The man didn't sit immediately. He stood at the edge of the doormat, water dripping from his coat into a small puddle beneath his shoes, and he looked down at it, as though calculating how much of a mess he had made. "I've gotten your floor wet. Floors can be cleaned." She opened the cabinet beneath the sink, took out 2 cotton towels, handed him one, and pushed the other over the puddle with her foot. "Fingers can't." He sat down. She lit the stove, set a kettle on the burner, then opened a drawer and took out a small knife and a piece of ginger. Her movements were quick, precise, and without waste, the kind of speed that belonged to someone who had done the same thing 10,000 times at 3 o'clock in the morning, when no one else was awake to see. She sliced the ginger thin, dropped it into a ceramic mug, poured in boiling water, and while she waited, she did something the man would remember for the rest of his life. She knelt in front of him. She didn't ask permission. She pulled the right leg of his trousers up to the middle of his calf, placed 2 fingers behind his ankle bone, and fell silent. The man went rigid. Not from fear. For the past 4 years, every time someone touched him, their hands had trembled. Doctors trembled. Accountants trembled. Even the waiter who poured his wine trembled, and he had grown so accustomed to seeing it that he no longer noticed. The way people stop hearing the hum of a refrigerator until the moment it goes quiet. This woman's hands didn't tremble. They were simply warm, and they were counting. "The pulse on the top of your foot is weak," she said without looking up. "Your skin is cold all the way to here." She pressed gently against the nail of his big toe, counted in silence, then moved to the other foot and repeated the entire examination. "How long have you been walking?" 3 blocks. The car broke down." 3 blocks doesn't do this to a person." She stood, poured the ginger tea into a glass, and set it in front of him. "Hold it with both hands. Don't drink yet. Keep the glass between your palms for about 5 minutes first." He obeyed. The heat seeped through his numb skin and turned sharply painful, and he had to hold back a sudden breath. She noticed. "Pain is good," she said. "Pain means the blood is coming back. What you should worry about is when you can't feel anything at all." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, resting both elbows on the table, and only then did he truly look at her. Her ash-brown hair had been tied back in haste with a stretched-out elastic band. Her pale blue uniform still bore a coffee stain along the collar. The shadows beneath her eyes weren't the kind left by one sleepless night. They were the kind that had settled into the flesh after years. "You're a nurse. Night shift. Palliative care at St. Auberon." He nodded slowly. "That's the place people go to die," she finished for him, and her voice was so calm that he had to look at her again. "You don't have to avoid the word. Where I work, everyone knows where they are. It's only outsiders who find it difficult to say." The kettle made a soft clicking sound as it began to cool. Outside, hail struck the metal roof of the garage in a steady, unbroken rhythm. "Aren't you afraid of strangers? I work nights with people at the end of their lives. There are other things I'm afraid of." He didn't ask what those things were. Something in the way she said it made him understand that another question would mean crossing a threshold he hadn't been invited to enter. "What's your name?" she asked. "Gus." "Just Gus?" "Tonight, just Gus." She studied him for 1 second longer than necessary, then nodded and didn't ask again. That was the second thing he would remember. This woman knew when to stop. And she stopped not because she was afraid, but because she respected him. She rose, took a container of cold rice and an egg from the refrigerator, and asked, "Have you had dinner?" "No, neither have I. My shift starts at 11 o'clock. She lit the stove again, and in the soft crackle of oil, she told him something small, something she hadn't meant to tell, the way a person drops a pebble into a well simply to hear the echo. When she was 15, she had learned how to read stories aloud to her mother through long, endless afternoons. That was the summer she realized what kind of work she was meant to do. He said nothing. He only held the glass of tea between both palms and watched her back, thinking about a question she had mentioned earlier without realizing she had mentioned it at all. She told him that years ago, one of her patients, an elderly woman, had taken hold of her wrist on her final night and asked, "You hold the hand of this whole hospital. Who holds yours?" Meredith laughed as she repeated it. A quick, fragile laugh. "I've never been able to answer that question," she said as she slid the egg onto a plate. Then, at the far end of the house, the lock on the front door turned once. Meredith turned off the stove. It was her first instinct, before she even had time to think. And later, when she looked back on it, she would find it almost funny that her first thought in that moment had been not to let the eggs burn. The sound of high heels crossed the stone-tiled hallway, unhurried, not a single step out of rhythm. Rosalind Thorne never walked quickly inside her own home, because in one's own home, there was nothing important enough to hurry for. She stopped in the kitchen doorway, removed her leather gloves one finger at a time, and looked inside with the expression of someone who had just discovered a stain on the tablecloth. Her hair was platinum, stiffly arranged, not a strand out of place even though hail was falling outside. Her lipstick was still perfect. She had returned from dinner, and she had reapplied her makeup in the car before stepping out, because Rosalind Thorne believed that a woman who crossed the threshold of her own home without first putting herself in order was a woman who had given up. Behind her, Cordelia approached, stopped at the corner of the kitchen, and placed one hand on the handle of the service door, not to open it, only to rest her hand there. Meredith saw the gesture and didn't understand it. Not yet, and that failure to understand would haunt her for a long time. "Meredith," Rosalind said. She didn't shout. Her voice was soft, clipped, polite, the same voice she had used for 20 years to tell reporters that her client had no comment. And that was more frightening than any scream, because a person who shouted was a person losing control, while a person who spoke that quietly was someone who had already made her decision. "Do you have a guest?" He was stranded in the hail. His car broke down 3 blocks from here, in my kitchen. "There's ice falling out there, Rosalind." "Yes," Rosalind said. "I just walked through it." She placed her gloves on the kitchen counter, very slowly, and that was when Meredith saw it. A bank envelope lay beside the place where Rosalind had set down her gloves. The white kind with a clear window and a dark blue stripe running along the left edge. It had already been opened, the top torn raggedly as though someone had ripped it apart with a thumb, and through that window, printed by a machine and clear as an accusation, were 3 words. Meredith Voss. She looked at it, only for a moment, no more than 2 seconds. But Rosalind was watching her, and Rosalind saw her look. In those 2 seconds, something was decided, and no one in that kitchen put it into words. Rosalind reached out, picked up the envelope, calmly folded it in half as though it were an electric bill, and slipped it into the pocket of her coat. "Cordelia," she said. "Yes, Mother." "Get me the spare set of keys from the drawer." Cordelia opened the drawer. She didn't ask why. She showed no surprise. She simply took out the key ring, handed it to her mother, then stepped back and placed her hand on the service door handle again. "Rosalind," Meredith said, and she heard her own voice, a voice that had shrunk to half its size, the same way it had been shrinking for 5 years. "I only made him a cup of tea. He'll leave in 10 minutes. 10 minutes, Rosalind repeated. She looked at the man sitting at the table, her eyes traveling from the shoes with peeling soles to the soaked baseball cap. And the inspection took about a second and a half, exactly as long as someone might need to read the label on a package of food and decide not to buy it. Do you know what your problem is, Meredith? You always think everything is 10 minutes. 10 minutes staying with a patient after your shift. 10 minutes lending someone the car. 10 minutes opening the back door at 10 o'clock at night for a man you don't even know. Then 5 years pass, and I'm still paying for all your 10 minutes. I pay for your medication, Meredith said. I have for 5 years. The electricity, the groceries, I pay. And I give you a roof over your head, Rosalind said. That makes us even. Then she did something no one in that kitchen had expected. She didn't shout. She didn't point a finger. She merely loosened the fingers holding the ring of keys and let it fall onto the tile floor. The metal rang out, sharp and thin, then died away. She turned toward the soaking wet man at the table. You're a delivery man, aren't you? He didn't answer. Then deliver this for me. She didn't look at Meredith when she said it. That was the cruelest part. She's something my husband left behind. I've kept her for 5 years. Now I'm giving her back. For a moment, no one moved. The man sat perfectly still, both palms still wrapped around the glass of ginger tea that had already gone cold. And something ancient and bitterly cold opened its eyes inside his chest. But he said nothing. He only remembered. Meredith no longer looked at Rosalind. She didn't know why, but she turned her head toward the hallway, toward the foot of the staircase leading upstairs, near the side door that opened into the garage. And she saw it. Her suitcase. The gray fabric suitcase she had bought from a second-hand store when she was 22. The suitcase she kept in the attic and didn't touch even once in an entire year, was now standing at the foot of the stairs. The zipper had been pulled shut. The handle stood upright. An elastic cord had been tied around its body, the way people tied luggage when they were afraid the lock might burst open along the road. Outside, hail continued to strike the garage roof in its steady rhythm. Inside the house, everything was silent, and Meredith Voss stood in the warmest kitchen in the entire mansion, staring at her own suitcase, which someone had brought down, packed, bound shut, and placed at the foot of the stairs at some unknown time, and she understood something no one needed to say aloud. Tonight wasn't the reason. Tonight was only the day they had chosen. Meredith didn't argue a single word. Later, when someone asked why she hadn't fought back, she wouldn't be able to explain, because the truth was too simple to shape into a sentence. She didn't argue because there was nothing left to argue about. People only argue when they still believe reason can change something, and the suitcase at the foot of the stairs had already answered that question for her. So she simply stood there. Her arms rested at her sides. The dish towel still hung over her shoulder. She stood in the middle of the kitchen, and she waited. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She had given up the habit of waiting for apologies during the 2nd year. She wasn't waiting for an explanation either, because she knew Rosalind never explained herself. Explanations were for people who still needed the agreement of others. She was waiting for only one very small thing. 3 words. She was waiting for one of the 2 women in this house to call her name. Meredith. Wait. That was all. It didn't have to be an apology. It didn't have to be regret. She only needed someone to call out to her, to prove that during those 5 years she had existed here as a human being and not as an expense. She counted silently in her head, out of the habit of someone accustomed to measuring a pulse. 1, 2, 3. Rosalind turned toward the sink, opened the faucet, and poured herself a glass of water. She took 3 sips, set the glass down, and wiped the rim with the tip of her finger. 4, 5, 6. Cordelia took her phone from the pocket of her coat. The screen lit up, casting a pale blue glow across her face. She scrolled downward once with her thumb, then once again. 7, 8, 9. Outside, a large piece of hail struck the gutter and bounced into the yard. In the kitchen, the pan of eggs slowly cooled on the extinguished burner, the oil congealing into a cloudy film across the bottom. 10. Meredith stopped counting. At the dining table, the man called Gus remained perfectly still, both palms wrapped around the glass of ginger tea that had lost its warmth. He didn't look at Rosalind. He didn't look at Cordelia. He looked at the woman standing in the middle of the kitchen, at the way she kept her back straight while waiting for something that never came. And he understood that she had stood like this many times before. No one waited that way the first time. The first time, people cried, or screamed, or ran. It was only by the 10th time, the 20th time, that they learned how to stand still and wait with both feet planted that firmly beneath them. And that steadiness was harder to witness than tears. The words "this thing" still hung in the kitchen air. He had heard them, and something very old and very cold had opened its eyes inside his chest. It wasn't anger. Anger was hot. Anger was loud. Anger made people ruin their work. What had awakened inside him was far quieter and far more enduring. It was simply the act of remembering. Over the past 10 years, hundreds of people had sat across from him and spoken words they regretted for the rest of their lives. And not one of them had understood that the decisive moment wasn't when he answered, but when he fell silent and took note. He took note of Rosalind Thorne's voice, soft, clipped, and polite. He took note of the way she lifted the bank envelope and folded it in half between 2 fingers. He took note of the daughter's hand resting on the service door handle, a hand that had been there before anything had even happened. And he didn't say a word, because speaking would break the role he was playing, because the cheap nylon coat he wore served a purpose, and that purpose hadn't yet been fulfilled, because he hadn't come to this house tonight for the woman standing in the middle of the kitchen, but for a name he had read in a file 3 days earlier, and that name had just crossed the room before him, removing her gloves 1 finger at a time and taking 3 sips of water. But there was one thing he hadn't anticipated, and he realized it in that very moment. He had come here to observe a target. He hadn't expected to watch someone being crushed beneath that target's heel right in front of him while he sat in silence, holding a glass of tea made by the very person being destroyed. Meredith bent down. She picked the ring of keys up from the tile floor, brushed it with her palm, then placed it neatly on the kitchen counter beside Rosalind's leather gloves. She did it without resentment. She did it exactly the way she cleared a tray after a patient had passed away, carefully and in its proper place, because it was the final thing left that could still be done with dignity. "Your keys," she said. Rosalind didn't answer. Meredith took the dish towel from her shoulder, folded it in half, and hung it over the rail beside the sink. Then she walked past Cordelia, through the kitchen doorway, into the stone-tiled hall, and started up the stairs. She didn't look at the suitcase as she passed it. At the 4th step, she stopped for one brief moment, so brief that only the man sitting in the kitchen noticed. She stood there with her back turned and waited one final time. No one called her name. She continued upward. The room above the garage was about 3 degrees colder than the rest of the house, and Meredith had known that since her first winter there. She turned on the light. A round bulb hung loosely from the center of the ceiling, casting a sickly yellow glow, and within that glow she saw what she had already suspected. The wardrobe door stood slightly open. Several empty hangers dangled inside. Someone had been in here. Someone had stood in the middle of this room, opened her wardrobe, chosen the things they believed belonged to her, and packed them into the suitcase at the foot of the stairs. She sat on the edge of the bed and remained there for a while. Not because she was tired, but because her mind needed time to understand that someone had touched every one of her belongings while she had been at the hospital holding the hand of someone who was about to die. Then she stood and began checking what they had missed. 3 pale blue uniforms still hung in the wardrobe. They hadn't taken them, perhaps because they didn't consider them clothing. She folded all 3 and placed them to one side. In the desk drawer was a small tin box containing her nursing pin, the one that had been fastened to her uniform during the graduation ceremony that no one from this house had attended. She picked it up, saw that the plating had tarnished around the edges, and slipped it into her pocket. On top of the wardrobe, inside a cardboard box, was her mother's old stethoscope. It was the heavy steel kind from the 1990s. Its rubber tubing hardened with age and cracked where it bent. It no longer worked. She had kept it anyway. Beside the bed was a framed photograph of her father, taken in the backyard of their old house, the house she hadn't been allowed to enter again since the funeral. He was laughing, holding a pair of barbecue tongs in one hand, and it was the only photograph she owned in which he hadn't known someone was taking his picture. She laid the photograph face down in her palm, then wrapped it inside a sweater. Finally, she pulled open the bottom drawer, reached all the way into the back, and took out the notebook. It was an ordinary hardbound notebook with a moss green cover, the kind sold in any general store for less than $4. All 4 corners were worn. Inside was her handwriting, line after line, without a single blank space between them. Every line contained a name and a date. There were no notes, no medical records, nothing except a person's name and the day that person had died. The first entry had been written 6 years earlier in the rounded, careful handwriting of a newly graduated nurse. The final entry had been written in blue ink 3 nights ago, the letters trembling slightly because she had been awake for 20 hours. There were 142 names in all. 142 times she had pulled a chair close to the edge of a bed, taken hold of a hand no one else was there to hold, and remained until the machine stopped sounding. She didn't write them down so she could remember. She wrote them down because most of those people had no one left to remember them, and she believed there should be at least one place in this world where their names had been written by hand, instead of typed into a record system. She placed the notebook between the folded uniforms, in the safest place among her belongings, and as she did, the memory came rushing back without permission, as it always did. When she was 22, on a Tuesday morning, a gurney was pushed through the automatic doors of the emergency department, and the man lying on it was her father. She had been there, wearing the uniform of that same hospital, and for 22 minutes, she had done everything 4 years of training had taught her to do. The final words he spoke to her, while his fingers could still tighten around hers, were, "Don't let the family fall apart, Mary." He died at 9:17 that morning, and Rosalind Thorne, who had been standing about 10 feet away and had heard every word, used that sentence as a chain for the next 5 years. Every time Meredith spoke about moving out, every time she mentioned renting a room near the hospital so she wouldn't have to endure a 40-minute bus ride after a night shift, Rosalind only had to repeat those words. "Your father wanted you here. Are you going to break a promise you made to a dead man?" And every time, Meredith stayed for 1 more year. She lowered herself onto the floor with her back against the side of the bed, and she cried. She made no sound. Only her shoulders trembled as tears ran down her chin and fell into her open palm. She allowed herself to cry for exactly 40 seconds, because she knew precisely how long she could endure it before she became unable to stand again. Then she wiped her face with her sleeve, drew in a breath, and got to her feet. She carried the bundle of belongings downstairs. The suitcase was still standing there, latched shut, its handle raised, the elastic cord wrapped around its body. She opened it in the middle of the hallway, arranged the rest of her belongings inside, then closed the zipper again. The kitchen light was still on. Rosalind was wiping the countertop with a damp cloth. Cordelia was still looking down at her phone. The man named Gus had risen from his chair and now stood beside the service door with both arms hanging at his sides. Meredith stopped at the threshold. She called out once, "Rosalind." No one looked up. She pulled the door open. Hail struck her face, sharp and bitterly cold, and she stepped outside. The suitcase wheel jammed on the very first block. A piece of hail the size of a thumb lodged itself in the gap beside the wheel, and after about 20 steps, the wheel stopped turning altogether and scraped along the sidewalk like something wounded. Meredith bent down and tried to pry it loose with her fingers, but she had already lost all feeling in them, and all she managed to touch was the sharp edge of the plastic, which sliced a thin line across the tip of her index finger. She stood up, changed hands, and carried it. The suitcase was heavier than she had expected, not because there was much inside, but because water had soaked into the gray fabric. About every 30 steps, she changed hands again. By the second block, she stopped counting steps and counted streetlights instead. The lights along Ashford Hollow stood exactly 100 feet apart, their glow a sickly yellow, and within each pool of light, the hail appeared as white streaks slanting through the darkness. A car passed, slowed slightly, then continued on. By the third block, water had begun seeping through the sole of her left shoe. She remembered that she had meant to replace those shoes the month before, and hadn't, because that month's money had gone toward Rosalind's blood pressure medication. She thought of it with perfect calm, the way someone might remember they had forgotten to buy laundry detergent. By the fourth block, her hand could no longer hold on. The bus stop appeared at the corner, a curved plastic shelter with 3 glass walls, one of them broken long ago and patched with cloudy tape. She dragged the suitcase beneath the roof, and the moment she was sheltered from the hail, her fingers opened without her telling them to. The suitcase toppled sideways onto the concrete, and Meredith dropped to her knees, not to rest. She knelt because a thought had just pierced through her like a needle. She had opened the suitcase in the hallway. She had put her belongings inside. But did she remember closing the zipper? Was she certain the notebook was still tucked between the folded uniforms? Or had it fallen out when the wheel jammed? Or when she changed hands at the 7th streetlight? Or had she never packed it at all because her hands had been trembling and her vision blurred? She tore off the elastic cord. She pulled open the zipper. She searched. She dragged out the 3 uniforms and threw them onto the wet concrete without thinking about the dirt soaking into them. The tin box holding her nursing pin fell out. Its lid sprang open, and the pin rolled once before landing face down. She pulled out the sweater wrapped around her father's photograph and placed it to one side, her mother's stethoscope, a pair of socks, a light coat, and at the very bottom, pressed between 2 layers of fabric, was the moss-green hardbound notebook. She pulled it free. She opened it to check, flipping through the pages quickly, and beneath the bus stop light the writing appeared, line after line, names and dates, 142 times. The final page still held the blue ink she had written 3 nights earlier. It was there, and only then, with the notebook clutched against her chest as she sat on the concrete among her wet clothes scattered around her, did Meredith Voss finally collapse. She cried the way people vomited, without control, her whole body folding inward, and the sound of her sobbing was almost entirely swallowed by the hail hammering against the plastic roof. She didn't know how long she had been sitting there when a weight settled onto the edge of the bench beside her. She didn't look up. She knew who it was, because she had heard his footsteps following behind her for 4 blocks, and had deliberately refused to turn around. The man said nothing. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He didn't tell her everything would be fine. He didn't say any of the things people always said in moments like this, and no one ever believed. He simply sat down. Then he removed the cheap nylon coat from his body and draped it over her shoulders. The coat was soaked through. The stitching at the cuffs had come loose, and the collar had faded. It was something purchased to help him play the part of a man who had nothing. But now, when he took it off and stood beneath the hail wearing only a thin sweater, it stopped being part of the disguise. It became the only thing he had to give, and he gave it. "You don't have to sit here," she said. "I know. Then why are you?" He remained silent for a moment. Outside, a piece of hail struck the broken glass and bounced away. "Because tonight you warmed the hands of a man you believed had nothing." Meredith didn't answer. She held the notebook tighter. He took a phone from his pants pocket. She caught a glimpse of it, and a faint thought passed through her mind that the phone didn't look as though it belonged with the rest of this man. But she was too tired to hold on to the thought. He dialed a number. He spoke 11 words, slowly and clearly, then ended the call. It lasted less than 30 seconds. 3 minutes later, a black sport utility vehicle pulled up and stopped close to the curb, without sounding its horn or flooding the shelter with bright headlights. The door opened. A very large man stepped out, somewhere in his late 40s, his shoulders so broad that the wool coat he wore stretched tightly across his back. He opened a black umbrella, walked around the front of the vehicle, and held it over the entire bus shelter, shielding even the pile of wet clothing scattered across the concrete. Then he bent down, picked up the nursing pin lying face down, wiped it clean with his thumb, and placed it in Meredith's palm. "Please," he said. "My friend." The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a red brick building on Federal Hill, above a bakery that had closed at 9 o'clock that evening, and the scent of baked dough still lingered in the stairwell. The large man carried the suitcase upstairs first, set it beside the door, handed the key to Meredith rather than Gus, then gave a single nod and went back down. Inside, everything was so clean it felt cold. A wooden table and chairs, a gray fabric sofa, a refrigerator stocked with food, and a heater that had already been turned on before they arrived. There were no photographs on the walls, no letters on the table, nothing at all to suggest who had ever lived there. Meredith stood in the middle of the room, the wet nylon coat still draped over her shoulders, the notebook still held against her chest, and she didn't sit down. "Who are you?" He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't laugh it away. He raised one hand and removed the baseball cap, and beneath the ceiling light, his face appeared fully for the first time that night. Short black hair, a sharply angled jaw, a thin scar running along the left side of it, old and faded white, and pale gray eyes that looked directly at her without blinking, the eyes of a man accustomed to saying things that drained the color from other people's faces. He held his right hand beneath the light. On his little finger was a plain silver ring with no design, worn smooth along the inside. "My name is August Krall." Meredith Voss had worked as a nurse in Providence for 6 years, and during those 6 years, there were certain names that were never spoken aloud inside the hospital. 3 years earlier, on a Saturday night, a gravely wounded man had been brought into the emergency department, and for the next 4 hours, 2 men in suits had stood in the hallway without speaking to anyone. No one asked who they were. The head nurse on duty that night, a woman who had worked in nursing for 28 years and had never been afraid of anything, had pulled Meredith into the medication room and spoken in the lowest voice Meredith had ever heard her use, saying that no one was to document anything beyond what was strictly required, and that the family name involved shouldn't be repeated even during shift handoff. That name was Crawl. Meredith took one step backward. She hadn't meant to. Her foot moved on its own, and she heard the wet heel of her shoe slide lightly across the wooden floor. She was afraid. There was nothing noble in that moment. No understanding. No compassion. There was only a 27-year-old woman who had just been thrown out of her home at 11 o'clock at night, standing in an apartment that wasn't hers, suddenly realizing who the man she had invited into the kitchen truly was. August saw her step back, and inside his chest, something painfully familiar closed in silence. 4 years earlier, his father had lain on the 7th floor of a public hospital south of the city, dying from end-stage kidney failure. Otto Crawl had been 72 years old then, weighed 108 pounds, and could no longer sit up on his own. During his final 11 days, not one nurse remained in his room for more than 4 minutes. People traded shifts so they wouldn't have to take that room. They left his food tray on the threshold. The attending physician stood in the hallway and spoke to August through the narrow opening of the partly closed door, and throughout those 11 days, the man never once stepped fully inside. One young nurse, her hair tied high, perhaps 24 years old, had tried. She entered to take his blood pressure, but her hands trembled so badly that she couldn't fasten the cuff and had to start over 3 times. Otto Crawl watched those hands shake, then turned his face toward the wall. He died at 3:40 in the morning. His son sat in the hallway about 30 feet away, kept outside by visiting hour rules that the hospital had enforced with unusual strictness in this particular case, and they didn't open the door to let him in until everything was over. Otto died alone. No one held his hand. 3 weeks earlier, while he could still speak, Otto had told his son something August carried with him for the next 4 years. People aren't afraid of you, August. They're afraid of the name. One day, you won't be able to tell who truly cares about you and who is only calculating how to survive. So that night, when a woman knelt on the kitchen floor and placed 2 fingers against his ankle without the slightest tremor in her hand, August Crawl had sat perfectly still like a man hearing a language he had believed extinct. He didn't move toward her. He pulled a wooden chair away from the table, sat down, and placed both hands flat on the tabletop, palms down, fingers spread apart. It was the posture of a man disarming himself, and he remained that way. "You're allowed to be afraid of me," he said. "You should be. Most of what you've heard at the hospital is true. Why did you go to that house? That's a fair question. But I'm not going to answer it tonight." "Why not?" "Because if I answer now, you'll think I'm trying to buy you with the truth. I don't want you owing me anything." He nodded toward the door. "It isn't locked. The key is in your hand, not mine. The rent has been paid through the end of the month. There's food in the refrigerator. Get some sleep. Tomorrow morning you decide." Then he stood, walked out, and closed the door very gently behind him. Meredith didn't sleep. She sat on the sofa until 4 o'clock in the morning, holding the notebook in both hands, and she thought. The next morning, when August returned at 9 o'clock, the apartment was empty. The envelope of money he had left on the table was still untouched and unopened. Beside it lay the cheap nylon coat, washed, dried, and folded into a neat square. On top of it was a scrap of paper torn from a notebook, written in blue ink. "Thank you for the coat. I washed it." August Crawl stood there for a very long time. Then he picked up the note, folded it, slipped it into his breast pocket, and didn't go after her. The black sport utility vehicle was parked at the corner of Atwell's, 2 blocks from the bakery, its engine still running to keep the air conditioning on. The dome light glowed overhead. Benny sat behind the wheel, his broad hands resting on his thighs, his eyes fixed straight through the windshield as though there were something outside worth watching besides the hail that had softened into cold rain. August sat in the passenger seat with an open file across his lap, the nylon coat folded into a neat square on the dashboard, and the note written in blue ink, still tucked inside his breast pocket. "What time did she leave?" August asked. 7:10. The number 14 bus. Renz followed her as far as the central station, then stopped, just as you told him. "Good. You don't want to know where she got off?" "No." Benny nodded. He had worked with August Crawl for 11 years, and had learned not to ask the same question twice. August turned to the 3rd page of the file. It was a statement from an intermediary account opened at a small bank in Cranston, the kind of account people created for money to pass through, not to remain in. 4 months, 11 transfers, $260,000 in total, divided into amounts below the reporting threshold, clever enough to escape the attention of a computer and foolish enough to attract the attention of a human being. The accountant named Pell had confessed on Thursday afternoon in an office near the harbor after being told that he had 2 choices, and that one of those choices would still allow him to go home and have dinner with his wife. He said he hadn't stolen anything. He had only been paid to open a path. The person who opened that path for him was a lawyer. The person who paid the lawyer was the name listed on the account ownership documents. August placed his index finger on that name. Thorne. Read the section below that for me, August said, handing over the file. Benny took it, tilted it toward the dome light, and read slowly in the deep, even voice of a man who was never in a hurry. Rosalind Thorne, 56 years old, former chief executive of Vance & Thorne Communications, dissolved 7 years ago. Her former specialty was crisis communications. 3 years earlier, she had accepted a contract to repair the reputation of a man named Merrick Fawcett, the owner of a chain of warehouses in Quonset, and a transportation partner of the Crawl organization for 4 consecutive years. She had done her job well. The article was removed. A reporter changed his mind. A city council investigation died quietly because no one was willing to speak. Fawcett paid her, and that should have been the end of it. But Rosalind Thorne didn't work by forgetting. She kept everything, every recording, every email, every name she had been forced to buy, and 14 months later, after her company had closed and her personal accounts had run dry, she returned to Fawcett with an envelope and a very polite proposal. Fawcett paid the first time, then the second. Then he began taking money from places that didn't belong to him, and one of those places passed across Pell's desk. And that was why, on Tuesday night, August Crawl had put on a cheap nylon coat, left his car 3 blocks from Ashford Hollow, and walked through the hail to the front of a mansion. He hadn't gone there looking for kindness. He had gone to see the house with his own eyes, to learn how many people were inside, who was there at what hour, and which door had no camera. He had chosen the service entrance, because a delivery man could stand there without anyone asking questions. He had calculated everything except one thing: the person who opened the door. "Did you know she was in the house?" Benny asked. "I knew there were 3 women living there. The file said one was the late husband's stepdaughter. I thought she was a child." "She isn't a child." "No." August looked through the window. Across the street, a man was pulling down the metal shutter of a laundromat. "She's 27 years old, and she knelt down to check my pulse before she asked my name." Benny was silent for a moment. "I read the entire file," he said. "There's a section on page 6. That house hasn't employed domestic help in 5 years. I know. Do you know what that means?" "I know." Rain tapped against the roof of the vehicle in a steady language of its own. August closed the file, placed it on his lap, and sat perfectly still. He thought about how he had entered that house searching for a predator and had found the predator's victim instead, and how that victim had made him ginger tea and told him to hold it in both hands and not drink too quickly. He thought about the suitcase already bound with an elastic cord at the foot of the stairs. "So, what do we do about Mrs. Thorne?" Benny asked. "I'll finish dealing with Fawcett next week. As for her, you only have to say the word, quietly. No one has to get hurt." August didn't answer immediately. He remained silent for so long that Benny thought the question had been dismissed. Outside, the laundromat lights went dark. "Not yet," August said. "Not yet? Not yet." He raised a hand to his breast pocket, touched the folded note inside, then lowered it again. "If I deal with her this week, Meredith will never know. And 10 years from now, she'll still believe she was someone they threw away in the rain. I don't want to leave her with something like that." "Then what do you want?" August looked straight through the windshield. "I want to see how far she can walk on her own." Meredith rented a room on Pine Street, on the 2nd floor, with a window facing the brick wall of the building next door. $190 a week, paid in advance. She covered it with what remained of her wages from the previous pay period. Then she went to work. For her first shift, she arrived 40 minutes early because she wasn't used to the new bus route, and she stood in the 4th floor hallway, looking at the lights glowing inside the patient rooms, and felt something she told no one. She felt lighter. For the first time in 5 years, when her shift ended, she wouldn't have to return to a place where she had to apologize for existing. During her second shift, she sat with an elderly man named Abner Doyle, who had terminal lung cancer, until 3 o'clock in the morning, and he told her about the fishing boat he had owned when he was 20. After her third shift, she came home at 7 o'clock in the morning, slept for 9 straight hours, and woke with the strange feeling that perhaps she was going to be all right. During her fourth shift, at 11:15 that night, the head nurse called her out of the medication room and told her that Human Resources wanted to see her at 9 o'clock the following morning. She didn't look Meredith in the eyes when she said it. The Human Resources office was on the ground floor, at the end of a windowless hallway. 3 people sat on the other side of the table. One was from Human Resources, one from Compliance, and one was a hospital attorney, seated at the far end, who didn't introduce himself. A thin file lay on the table beside a glass of water no one touched. The representative from Compliance spoke first. The hospital had received a formal complaint from an identified complainant, accompanied by supporting documents concerning the dispensing of controlled pain medication. The complaint alleged that Nurse Meredith Voss had used her position to divert medication outside the hospital over a period of 2 years. He opened the file and pushed it toward her. "Do you recognize this signature?" Meredith looked down. It was a copy of a prescription form, blurred at one corner. The patient's name, the date, the medication, the dosage, and in the bottom box, beside the physician's authorization, was the nurse's confirming signature. The capital M leaned slightly to the right. The tail of the S stretched out and ended abruptly because she always signed in a hurry. She recognized it immediately, because she had signed it. This was the point where another person might have said the signature was forged, that this was a conspiracy, that the woman hated her, and all of those things might have been partly true, but the signature was real. It had begun 2 years earlier, on an evening in November. Rosalind had been suffering from back pain, real pain, and Meredith had examined her herself and known it was real. A damaged disc pressing against a nerve that Rosalind refused to have surgically repaired. Her doctor prescribed medication, until 1 month he stopped because she had reached the legal limit. She was in pain. She couldn't sleep. She paced through the house at 2 o'clock in the morning, and Meredith heard her footsteps. Then one day, Rosalind sat on the edge of the bed, her face pale, and spoke in the voice she had used only a handful of times during those 5 years, a voice that was almost pleading. "You work at the hospital. You know how. Just this once." Meredith had said no. She said no for 3 weeks. Then Rosalind stopped pleading and began using the weapon that had always worked. "Your father wanted you to keep this family together. He lay there and told you not to let it fall apart. Now I'm in so much pain I can't stand, and you're standing there talking about rules." And Meredith had signed. Not once. The first time, it was one form for a small dose, written under the name of a patient who had already been discharged. She vomited in the staff restroom afterward. The second time was easier. By the 5th, she no longer became sick. Over 2 years, there had been 11 forms in all. She hadn't taken money. She hadn't sold anything to anyone. She had done it because she pitied a woman in pain, because she had been bound by the words of a dead man, and because she had believed, foolishly and stubbornly, that if she did enough for them, one day they would look at her as family. But the reason didn't matter. The law didn't ask for reasons. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" the Human Resources representative asked. Meredith looked up. She could have told them everything. She could have spoken about the back pain, the 2 o'clock nights, the final words of her father being used as a restraint around her throat. She could have cried, and perhaps someone in that room would have softened. But she looked down at the prescription form once more, at her own signature, and understood that every explanation she offered now would only be another way of saying that she had possessed a good reason to break the law. And she had spent 6 years telling nursing students that no such reason existed. "That signature is mine," she said. The 3 people across the table looked at one another. "You're confirming that you signed it?" "I am." "Were you coerced? Did anyone threaten you?" Meredith remained silent for a long moment. She thought of Rosalind sitting on the edge of the bed, pale with pain. "No," she said. "No one held anything against me. I picked up the pen myself." The attorney at the end of the table lowered his eyes and wrote 1 line. The decision was read aloud in 4 minutes. Immediate suspension without pay. Her case would be referred to the State Board of Nursing. A hearing would be scheduled within 3 to 6 months. Until a ruling was issued, she was prohibited from performing any professional activity within the scope of nursing practice, anywhere and in any form. If the board ruled against her, Her nursing license would be permanently revoked. She signed the report. The capital M leaned slightly to the right, and the tail of the S stretched out before ending abruptly. In the basement changing room, she opened her locker. Her stethoscope, a box of pens, a spare pair of shoes. Her white coat hung from a hanger, her name badge still pinned over the left side of the chest. She removed the badge and slipped it into her pocket. Then she took down the coat, laid it across her lap, and folded it. She folded both sleeves inward, folded it lengthwise, smoothed the crease with her palm twice, then 3 times, far more carefully than necessary, the way a person folds something they know they will never open again, and she didn't cry. On the first night after her suspension, Meredith slept for 8 straight hours. She woke at 10 o'clock in the morning, sunlight falling across the brick wall beyond her window in a pale golden patch, and for the first 3 seconds, she felt well. Then she remembered why she had been allowed to sleep, and that feeling of wellness became something else. She lay still, staring at the ceiling, thinking that perhaps there was no stranger punishment in the world than having one's work taken away and being rewarded with sleep. She had longed for 8 hours of sleep for 6 years. Now she had them, and they tasted like something stolen. She sat up, emptied her wallet onto the bed, and counted. 1 $20 bill, 1 10, 2 5s, and 2 1s. $42. Her room had been paid through the end of the following week. She had no credit card, because during her 5 years in the Thorne house, everything had been in Rosalind's name. She sat there for a long time, with the $42 arranged in a row across the blanket, and she made a very simple calculation, and the answer to that calculation was 11 days. She didn't call August Kroll. She had his number, not because he had given it to her directly, but because on the night at the Federal Hill apartment, he had written a string of numbers on the back of a bakery receipt and left it on the table, and she had taken it with her without understanding why. That receipt remained at the bottom of her handbag for 3 weeks. She didn't unfold it. Some evenings, she felt it with her fingertips while searching for her keys, and she pushed it deeper into the bag. She didn't know whether he still existed in her life. She didn't know whether she wanted him to exist in it either. And that was the question that kept her awake more than anything else. The first job she found was handing out flyers for a newly opened mattress store in Olneyville. $9 an hour, 4 hours a shift. Standing at an intersection in the March wind, people walked past without taking one. Some took a flyer, then dropped it on the sidewalk 2 steps away, and she had to pick it up because the store owner said that if the city issued a fine, it would be deducted from her pay. The second job was washing dishes at a Portuguese restaurant on Ives Street, from 5 o'clock in the afternoon until midnight, 4 nights a week. The owner's name was Fernanda. She was 60 years old, and didn't ask Meredith a single question about her past. She only looked at Meredith's hands and said in heavily accented English that these were hands accustomed to work. The kitchen was hot, the water was hot, and after 4 hours, the skin on Meredith's hands reddened and split between the fingers. But there was food there, and by 11 o'clock at night, when most of the customers had gone, Fernanda would often ladle her a bowl of fish soup and sit across from her without speaking, smoking a cigarette and looking toward the door. During the day, whenever she had no shift, Meredith went to the public library at Empire Square. She went because the library was heated, and because there was nothing to do in her rented room except think. She sat in the row of chairs beside the professional books, rereading certification study materials for an examination she would no longer be permitted to take, and sometimes she fell asleep there, her head tilted to one side, until a custodian passed and cleared their throat. And it was at the library that she began to notice. A library was where people went when they had nowhere else to go. There were older men who sat all morning with a newspaper open before them without ever turning the page. There were women speaking Spanish and Cape Verdean Creole at the public computers, struggling to complete forms in English they didn't understand well enough. There were men with thick calluses on their hands, still wearing reflective work vests, asleep at the tables between shifts at the harbor. She began hearing fragments of their stories, not because she was eavesdropping, but because people spoke quietly in a silent room, and she happened to be sitting nearby. One man said he had suffered chest pain for 3 months but hadn't gone to a doctor because the last time he had sought care, he had received a bill for $1,200 for an imaging scan and been told to go home and monitor his symptoms. A young woman said she wouldn't take her mother to the hospital because her mother had no papers, and everyone told her the hospital would ask questions. A dock worker told his friend that his shoulder had been hurting for 4 weeks, But if he missed one day, he would lose his place, and if he went to a doctor, he would have to miss half the day. Meredith listened to those fragments with ears trained by 6 years of nursing to recognize what was serious. And she realized that at least 3 of those people were suffering from something a trained professional would need only 15 minutes to assess and determine what should be done. But none of them would walk through a hospital door. Not because they were ignorant, because they had done the calculation, and the answer had been no. One Thursday afternoon, while she was straightening a stack of materials before returning them to the shelf, an elderly woman sitting 2 seats away leaned toward her. She was about 70, wearing a knitted hat and holding an amber-colored medicine bottle. "Could you read this for me?" she asked. "My eyesight isn't good anymore. My daughter picked up the medicine and told me to take 2 pills, but this label doesn't look like it says 2. Meredith took the bottle. She tilted it toward the light from the window and read the small print. Then she read it again. The label said 1 pill every 12 hours, and at the bottom, printed in bold letters, was a warning not to take it with the blood pressure medication whose name the elderly woman had mentioned only moments earlier. Meredith didn't tell the elderly woman that she was taking the medication incorrectly. She read the instructions on the label aloud, word for word, then read the warning printed at the bottom, also word for word, and afterward she told the woman that she should call the pharmacy that had dispensed the medication that very afternoon and read those 2 lines back to the pharmacist. The woman asked whether Meredith was a doctor. Meredith said no. She asked what Meredith thought, then. Meredith said, "I'm not allowed to decide that for you, but I can help you make the call right now." And she walked with her to the telephone booth in the library lobby, dialed the number, handed her the receiver, then stood 2 steps away until the call was over. 3 days later, the elderly woman returned to the library with a friend. Then that friend brought her sister-in-law. By the 3rd week, 6 people were looking for Meredith among the chairs beside the professional books, and the library staff had begun watching her with uneasy expressions, because a library wasn't a place for people to gather and discuss medications. It was Fernanda at the restaurant who first mentioned the church. St. Ferris Church stood at the end of the street bearing the same name, a gray stone building more than a century old, its congregation growing smaller with each passing year, and its basement left unused ever since the religious education classes had ended. The pastor was Father Ambrose Deal, nearly 70 years old, and after listening to Meredith explain for 10 minutes, he asked only one question. "Are you legally allowed to do this?" Meredith had prepared her answer, because she had been asking herself that same question for an entire week, and had spent 3 evenings at the library rereading the state regulations governing nursing practice. "There are things I'm allowed to do and things I'm not," she said. "I'll only do what any ordinary person is permitted to do. Take blood pressure with an automatic machine, read medication labels aloud, apply adhesive bandages, teach people how to call emergency services, and what to say when the dispatcher answers, and take people to the hospital. I won't diagnose. I won't prescribe. I won't give injections, stitch wounds, or treat anything that requires my professional training." Father Deal studied her for a moment. "You said that as though you'd practiced it." "I have. Why?" "Because I'm under investigation," she said. "And if I cross that line even once, I'll lose my profession forever." He handed her the key to the basement that same afternoon, 2 evenings a week, Tuesdays and Saturdays, from 6 o'clock until 9. She bought an electronic blood pressure monitor for $41, a box of adhesive bandages, a bottle of rubbing alcohol, a new notebook, and a small whiteboard that she divided into 2 columns. The column on the left read, "Things I can do here." The column on the right read, "Things I'm not allowed to do here, so please don't ask me." She hung the board at the foot of the basement stairs and didn't take it down once during the next 10 weeks. More people came with each passing week. On some Saturdays, 20 people sat waiting in plastic chairs arranged in 2 rows. She measured their blood pressure, wrote the numbers on small paper cards for them to keep, and when a reading was dangerously high, she didn't name any illness. She simply pointed to the number and said, "A doctor needs to look at this, and I'll help you make an appointment." She spent an entire hour with a Cape Verdean woman, helping her practice 3 English sentences to say to an emergency dispatcher. She wrote down the names of 7 community clinics that accepted uninsured patients, along with the telephone number for each one, made 100 copies, and handed them to everyone who came through the door. On the Saturday evening of the 7th week, the basement door flew open, and 3 men wearing reflective work vests carried a 4th man down the stairs. The injured man was named Osmar Pinto. He was 39 years old and worked as a longshoreman at Fields Point. A cargo crate had slipped from a pallet and crushed his left hand. The hand was swelling, his fingers wouldn't straighten, and he had wrapped it in a towel. Everyone in the basement crowded toward him. Someone pulled out a chair. Someone called Meredith's name. One of Osmar's 3 friends, a powerfully built man named Tiago, put a hand on her shoulder and said in urgent, broken English that she had to look at it. She had to help him. He didn't have insurance, and going to the hospital would cost him 2 months of wages. Meredith bent down and looked. She studied the hand for about 5 seconds, and during those 5 seconds, 6 years of training rushed through her mind like water through a pipe. She knew exactly what needed to be done. She knew how to immobilize it, how to apply cold, which signs to watch for to determine whether compartment syndrome was developing, and she knew that if she did everything her mind was telling her to do, the man would be in far less pain within 20 minutes. She straightened. "No," she said. The entire basement fell silent. "What did you say?" Tiago asked. "I'm not touching his hand." She turned and pointed toward the whiteboard at the foot of the stairs. "The right column. It's been written there since the first week. But you know how. Everyone knows you know how." "Yes, I know how." She had already taken out her phone and was dialing. "And that's exactly why I'm not allowed to do it." She called a taxi. While they waited, she did the only 3 things she was permitted to do. She placed a chair cushion beneath Osmar's forearm to keep it elevated. She asked whether he took any regular medications and wrote his answer on a scrap of paper. Then she wrote down his name, the time the accident had happened, and how much the cargo crate weighed, so he could give the information to the intake nurse. She rode with him in the taxi. At the emergency department of Rhode Island Hospital, she sat beside him on a plastic chair for 4 hours and 15 minutes, never interrupting once, never telling the intake staff that she was a nurse too. It was after 1 o'clock in the morning when Osmar finally had a cast on his hand and a follow-up appointment slip in his pocket. Meredith paid for a taxi to take him home, then walked 2 blocks to the night bus stop. Before getting out of the taxi, Osmar turned toward her. "Why didn't you do it yourself? You sat here for 4 hours, but if you'd done it in the church basement, it would have taken 15 minutes. Meredith looked through the window. "Because I want to be allowed to do this work again when everything is over," she said. 3 days later, on Tuesday afternoon, as she unlocked the church basement door and turned on the lights, a black sport utility vehicle pulled to a stop across Ferris Street and shut off its engine. He came down the basement stairs close to 9 o'clock, after the last person had gone and Meredith was stacking the plastic chairs. This time there was no nylon coat. He wore a black wool overcoat with the collar raised, polished leather shoes, and no baseball cap to conceal his face. Benny remained at the top step with his back to the stairwell, and came no farther down. Meredith lowered the chair in her hands. She looked at August for about 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, she moved very quickly through thoughts that would have taken an ordinary person a full minute to process. Then she asked, "How long have you known I was here?" "Since the 2nd week. The 2nd week." She repeated the number slowly. "That means 10 weeks. 8 weeks. 10 weeks since the night of the hail. Then 10 weeks. She picked up the chair and placed it on the stack with more force than necessary. The sound of plastic striking plastic echoed through the empty basement. "You had someone following me." "Yes. You're not even going to deny it?" "I won't lie to you about small things," he said. "Because then, when I tell you the truth about something large, you won't believe me either." She turned to face him, and this time she made no effort to hide what she felt. "You knew I was suspended. I knew before you walked out of that building. You knew I stood at an intersection in Olneyville handing out flyers in the March wind. I knew. You knew I washed dishes for 7 hours every night at Fernanda's restaurant and didn't get back to my room until 1 o'clock in the morning. I even know the name of the cat in that kitchen." "Then why?" she said, and her voice broke in the middle of the sentence, not because she was crying, but because the anger had been held inside her for too long. "Did you sit in a car for 10 weeks and watch me count $42 on my bed? Do you know what that feels like? To have someone watch you drown and write it all down?" August didn't look away. "Yes," he said. "I know what that feels like. I sat in a hallway 30 feet from my father for 11 days. Meredith fell silent. "But that isn't the reason," he continued. "You want the real reason. I'll tell you. If I had walked into that rented room during the 2nd week and put money on the table, you wouldn't be standing here tonight. You would be sitting in a better apartment, eating better food. And every time you looked at me, you wouldn't know whether you were grateful or afraid. Then 5 years from now, you would realize you had traded one person who owned you for another. And you would hate me. You would hate me the way you should have hated her. Except this time you would blame yourself because you had agreed to it willingly. He paused. I would rather see you poor and free than comfortable and indebted to me. You had no right to decide that for me. No, he admitted. I didn't, and I did it anyway. You can hate me for that. I won't argue. Meredith turned away, walked to the foot of the stairs, and stood in front of the whiteboard divided into 2 columns. She said nothing for a long time. Last Saturday night, she said. Was one of your men here? Yes. Then you know what happened to Osmar Pinto's hand. I know you sat in the emergency department for 4 hours and 15 minutes. I know you paid for his taxi home and then walked to the night bus stop. He looked at the whiteboard behind her. And I know you could have treated that hand in 15 minutes. Is that why you came down here tonight? That's why I came down here tonight. He took a sheet of paper folded into quarters from the inside pocket of his coat and placed it on the wooden table where she kept the blood pressure monitor. 1 block from here, on the same street, number 114 Ferris Street, a 2-story building that used to be a printing shop. It's been empty for 4 years. The first floor has 9 rooms. The second can be used for storage and offices. I owned it before I knew you existed. You're giving me a building. No, I'm not giving you anything. This isn't a gift. He tapped one finger against the paper. It's a place to work, and it only means something if you're cleared. If the board takes your license, that building will remain an abandoned printing shop, and I won't give you a single dollar as consolation. Do you understand what I'm saying? Meredith understood. That was precisely what made her step closer to the table. She studied the paper for a long time without touching it. Then she raised her head. If I accept, she said, I have 3 conditions. At the top of the stairs, Benny turned his head. In the 11 years he had spent beside this man, he had heard many people bargain with August Krall, and every one of them had bargained by asking for less. No one had ever given him conditions. Go on, August said. First, no one is turned away. No one. We don't ask for papers. We don't ask about insurance. We don't ask what kind of work they do. And we don't ask whose side they're on. If someone from a family you dislike comes through that door wounded, that person still gets to lie down in one of my beds. And not one of your men will ever cross that threshold looking for them. August was silent. You haven't agreed, she said. I'm thinking about the consequences. So am I, but I've already finished thinking. All right, he said. Agreed. Second, not $1 of dirty money. I don't know how you earn your money, and I'm not asking. But every dollar that enters that building must have a source that can be proven on paper, audited, and taxed. If investigators ever come through the door, I want every ledger to be something we can open. That's more difficult than the first condition, he said. But it can be done. Agreed, Meredith nodded. Then she remained silent longer, and August realized that the 3rd condition was the one she had already thought through, perhaps weeks ago, perhaps on the night in the Federal Hill apartment. 3rd, she said, the name on the door. Any name you want. You can call it whatever you choose. I want it to be called Otto. August Krall didn't move. Put your father's name on the door, she said. So this time, he'll be allowed inside. In the basement of St. Ferris Church, the light bulb hanging from the ceiling made a soft sound and continued to burn. At the top of the stairs, Benny Sarr turned his face completely away and looked up at the ceiling, and the man whose name an entire city was afraid to speak stood there with one hand resting on the edge of the wooden table, unable to say a word. Finding it wasn't an achievement. It was only the result of someone digging too deeply into something else. During the 3 weeks after that night in the church basement, 2 of August's men continued reconstructing the entire trail of Rosalind Thorne's money. Not because of Meredith, but because Merrick Fawcett was still paying her, and August needed to know what else she had kept. They followed the accounts, then followed the person who had created those accounts, and that person was an attorney named Gerald Whitmarsh, 68 years old, with a 2-room office on Westminster Street, practicing family and estate law since 1982. Whitmarsh was the Voss family's private attorney. He was also the man who had received 11 small transfers from Rosalind Thorne over 4.5 years, totaling $78,000, all marked as annual consulting fees. There were no corresponding case files. On Thursday night, Benny placed a folder on the desk in front of August and said there was something he should read before going to sleep. Inside was a certified copy of a will, dated April 17th, 2019, signed by Hartley Voss, witnessed by 2 people, and notarized. It wasn't the will that had been executed. The version put into effect was an amendment drawn up 7 weeks later, 4 days before his stroke. The original left his daughter his entire ownership, share in Voss and Reddick building materials, along with the life insurance proceeds and half the value of the house. The amendment transferred everything to his wife, with a trust provision stating that she would be responsible for caring for her husband's stepdaughter until the young woman became established. The co-executor of the estate, together with attorney Gerald Whitmarsh, was Rosalind Thorne. On the final page of the file was the valuation of that ownership share at the time the estate was opened, $1,400,000. August read the entire file twice. Then he sat in silence for a long time, and Benny knew better than to say anything. August gave it to her on Saturday afternoon in the church basement, before opening time. He didn't begin with an explanation. He simply placed the folder on the wooden table beside the blood pressure monitor, stepped back once, and stood there. Meredith read. She read slowly, the way a person reads her own medical chart, pausing at every number, turning back to the previous page to compare dates. She read the names of both witnesses. She read her father's signature, the hurried, slanting handwriting she had seen thousands of times on school permission slips, birthday cards, and notes stuck to the refrigerator door. She reached the valuation page and stopped there. The basement light made a faint sound. Outside, someone came down the stairs and then went back up, perhaps after realizing it wasn't time yet. Meredith sat in the nearest plastic chair with the folder still open across her lap, and she remained that way for a long time. August had prepared himself for tears. He had prepared for anger, for her to leap to her feet, throw the papers onto the floor, and demand to know how he had obtained them. He hadn't prepared for silence. At last she spoke, and her voice was completely ordinary, almost relieved, and that was what hurt him. "When I was 23, she said, I asked her for $120 to buy a pair of work shoes. The old ones let water in. I asked 3 times over 2 weeks. The 3rd time, she gave me $70 and told me to remember to write it in the ledger." She turned back to the valuation page and looked at the number again. "I don't mourn the money," she said. "Listen to me clearly. I don't mourn a single dollar of it. I mourn the fact that I asked. I mourn that for 5 years, I stood in front of those 2 women and begged them to care about me a little." She raised her eyes to his. "Do you understand? I was standing on my own money, and I was begging." August didn't answer. There was no answer to that. She closed the folder and placed it on the table. "Is Whitmarsh still practicing?" "Yes." "If I take this to a lawyer, how long?" 3 years, August said. "Maybe 4. She'll fight it. She'll say you knew from the beginning and agreed. People will investigate you. They'll bring up the suspension and argue that a nurse who signed false prescriptions can't be trusted as a witness. In the end, you'll win, but you'll spend 3 or 4 years sitting in rooms with recording devices, telling the story of how she treated you over and over again." Meredith nodded slowly. "Then no." "What did you say?" "I'm not suing." He looked at her. $1,400,000. "I know. You're standing in a church basement with a $41 blood pressure monitor." "I know." She stood, picked up a stack of plastic chairs, and began arranging them in rows, because opening time was close. "Do you understand what 3 years of telling that story means? It means that for 3 more years, I'm still the girl they left above the garage. People will ask me, what did she say to you? What did she do to you? How did it make you feel? For 3 years, I'll sit there talking about her." She set the final chair down. "If I take it back through the courts, I'm still the person they made." August didn't argue. He had argued with men carrying guns beneath their coats, and won, but he knew when a door had closed. He managed only one sentence. "You have the right to change your mind at any time. I'll keep the papers. Keep them." That night, after leaving the church, August called someone at Narragansett Coastal Bank, where Rosalind Thorne had taken out a second mortgage on the Ashford Hollow house the previous September and had missed 4 payments. Over the next 4 days, through 3 legitimate companies belonging to his transportation fleet, he purchased the entire debt. He didn't notify her. He didn't send a demand letter. He didn't send anyone to knock on her door. He simply placed the file in the bottom drawer of his desk, locked it, and never said a word to Meredith. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in June, in a conference room on the 4th floor of the State Administration Building on Capitol Street. The Rhode Island State Board of Nursing had 7 members, seated in a curved row behind a long table, with a file of exactly the same thickness placed before each of them. Meredith arrived 40 minutes early. She wore the only white blouse she still owned that looked presentable, and a pair of black slacks she had bought for $9 at a second-hand store. August didn't go with her. He had asked, and she had said no, and the reason she gave was that if the 7 people sitting in that room saw him, they would stop seeing her. He had nodded, and hadn't insisted. Benny drove her there, parked 1 block from the building, and waited in the car for 3 hours. The representative from compliance spoke for 22 minutes. 11 prescription forms. 2 years. A handwriting examination had confirmed that the signatures were genuine. There was no evidence that the medication had been transferred for commercial purposes, and no evidence that the suspended nurse had used it herself. But there had been repeated misuse of her professional position to gain access to controlled medication over an extended period of time. The chair of the board, a silver-haired woman named Marguerite Oyeleran, turned toward Meredith and asked whether she wished to make a statement. Meredith stood. "I signed all 11 forms," she said. "I knew what I was doing when I signed them. I knew every time. There wasn't a single time when I signed one and believed I was doing the right thing." One board member looked up. "Were you threatened by anyone?" "No." "Did you receive any money?" "No." "Is there anything else you wish to say about the circumstances? About your reasons?" Meredith remained silent for 3 seconds. She could have spoken Rosalind Thorne's name at that moment. She could have told them about the back pain, the nights at 2 o'clock in the morning, her father's final words being used as a rope to bind her, and the suitcase already secured with an elastic cord at the foot of the stairs. There was a file locked inside a drawer belonging to a man on Federal Hill that could bring an entire family down in a single morning. She had everything. "No," she said. "There are no circumstances I need to present." I picked up the pen myself. "Mrs." Oyeleran watched her for a moment longer, then wrote 1 line. "The board notes that 1 witness has registered to speak, Dr. Wendell Ashcombe." The man seated in the back row stood. He was 68 years old, his back slightly stooped, wearing a charcoal suit that he probably wore only to funerals, and leaning on an aluminum cane. Meredith turned to look at him, and for 2 seconds, she didn't recognize him. Then she did. He had been the physician on duty that night. The night her father had been pushed through the automatic doors of the emergency department 5 years earlier. "I would like permission to speak about 2 matters," Ashcombe said. "The first concerns me. The second concerns her." He placed both hands on the back of the chair in front of him. "On June 11th, 2021, I was working the night shift in the emergency department at St. Auberon Hospital. My shift ended at 7 o'clock in the morning. I left the hospital at 6:40 because I was tired and because nothing was happening that morning. The patient, Hartley Voss, was brought in at 7:02. I wasn't there. I had gone home 20 minutes early. No one in the conference room spoke. I don't know whether my staying would have changed anything. Perhaps it wouldn't have. Most likely, it wouldn't have. But I have lived with those 20 minutes for 5 years, and I'm saying this here so the board will understand why I'm present this morning. I'm not an impartial person. I owe that family something I can't repay." He opened his briefcase and removed a stack of papers. "The second matter. During the past 10 weeks, beginning on the day of her suspension, Mrs. Voss has been present twice a week in the basement of St. Ferris Church. I visited 4 times without her knowing who I was. I would like to submit her records, and I ask the board to take particular notice of the sign hanging at the foot of the stairs." He held up a photograph of the whiteboard, divided into 2 columns. The column on the right lists the things she forbids herself from doing. It is longer than the column on the left. It is legally accurate. And it has been hanging there since the first week, before anyone began investigating her conduct there. He placed the next sheet on the clerk's table. This is a list of 9 cases during those 10 weeks that Mrs. Voss possessed the professional skill to treat on site and chose not to treat. 9 times, she called for transportation and accompanied the person to an emergency department. 4 times, she paid for the taxi herself. The 7th case on the list, Mr. Osmar Pinto, is someone I met personally. She sat with him in the waiting room for 4 hours and 15 minutes, and never once told the intake staff that she was also a nurse. in order to receive priority. Ashcombe raised his eyes toward the 7 people seated behind the long table. Members of the board, I have practiced medicine for 41 years. I know what a person who breaks rules for convenience looks like. Someone who wants to break the rules doesn't need to take 4 taxi rides in 10 weeks. He sat down. The board deliberated for 40 minutes. The decision was read shortly before 1 o'clock in the afternoon. A formal reprimand, to remain permanently in her professional record. 18 months of probation, during which Meredith Voss wouldn't be permitted to directly access, manage, or dispense controlled medication, and would be required to submit quarterly supervision reports. Her nursing license would be retained. Meredith signed the record. Then she walked into the hallway, continued to the far end, stood facing the wall, and her shoulders trembled for about 1 minute. Outside, Benny saw her come through the doors, lifted his phone, dialed a number, spoke 3 words, then ended the call. The building at 114 Ferris Street opened its doors on August 19th. Dr. Wendell Ashcombe was listed as the facility's owner and served as medical director. Meredith Voss held the position of head nurse, working strictly within the scope of her license and the conditions of her probation, while every authorization involving controlled medication was signed by Ashcombe or a contracted physician. Every ledger could be opened. On the sign mounted above the main entrance, cut from steel by a machine, there were 4 letters. Auto. During the first week, people walked past, read the name above the door, then looked at the black sport utility vehicle parked across the street and kept walking. In Ward 3, people began calling it the Crawl Family Clinic. During the first 7 days, a total of 4 patients crossed through that door. By the 4th week, the number 4 had become 41, because Fernanda had told everyone in the Portuguese market on Ives Street, because Osmar Pinto had told an entire shift at the Fields Point docks, and because in Ward 3, word of mouth traveled faster than any sign ever could. By the 7th week, the auto clinic was open 6 days a week, and 2 nurses were working alongside Meredith. On a Friday night near the end of September, at 11:20, a pickup truck stopped abruptly in front of the entrance. 2 men dragged a 3rd man out, left him on the steps, then climbed back into the truck and sped away. The young man lying on the steps was about 22 years old. The nurse on duty, Priya, recognized the tattoo on his wrist before she noticed anything else. It was the mark of the Marchetti family. Priya ran inside to call Meredith, and her hands were trembling so badly that she dropped the bandage scissors. The night security guard, one of Benny's men, blocked the doorway and said he wasn't permitted to let this man inside. Meredith walked past him. "Carry him into room 2, she said. "Mrs. Voss, I have orders." Orders from whom? He couldn't answer, because the order he had received was something no one had ever spoken aloud. It was simply a rule everyone in the organization had understood for the past 10 years. Benny called August at 11:27. Meredith worked for 7 hours. Dr. Ashcombe arrived at midnight, and the 2 of them remained in room 2 until morning. Outside, in the waiting room, the number of people gradually grew. No one called anyone. People simply arrived, sat down, and said nothing. By 3 o'clock in the morning, 11 men were sitting silently in the waiting room of a community clinic, and every one of them was waiting for the same thing. August arrived at 5:40. He didn't ask anyone a question. He walked straight through the waiting room, stopped at the door of room 2, and looked inside for about 3 seconds. The young man had been stabilized and was breathing evenly, while the woman beside his bed, who had been awake for 22 hours, was bent over writing something on a sheet of paper. August turned back. He didn't raise his voice, but he spoke into the silence of the waiting room, and in a room where 11 people were saying nothing, an ordinary voice could travel all the way to the far wall. "Condition number 1, he said to Benny. She said it. I agreed. No one asked him to repeat himself. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the young man from the Marchetti family was transferred to Rhode Island Hospital in an ambulance called by the clinic, carrying a complete and legally valid referral signed by Wendell Ashcombe. 3 weeks later, on Monday night, at 11 o'clock, no one knew exactly what had passed through the minds of the Marchetti family during those 3 weeks. Later, people were able to piece together something close to the truth. They didn't believe it. They had heard that a building bearing the name of August Krall's father had taken in one of their men and kept him there for 7 hours, and they couldn't believe such a thing had truly happened. They assumed a trap was being built, that someone was creating a place meant to lure their people inside, and they decided to destroy it before it could receive any more patients. The fire began in the storage room at the rear of the second floor, where records and supplies were kept. The fire alarm sounded at 11:04. At the time, 4 patients were staying in the building overnight. All adults, 3 men and 1 woman. The youngest of them, 47 years old. Priya and the other nurse brought all 4 outside within 6 minutes, following the exact procedure Meredith had forced the entire clinic to practice 3 times since opening day. By 11:11, all 4 patients were sitting safely on the sidewalk across the street, wrapped in blankets, with someone confirming that every person was accounted for. Meredith counted them again. 4. Everyone was there. Then she turned back toward the building. The moss-green hardbound notebook was inside the desk drawer at the end of the first-floor hallway. 142 names, written by hand, together with the new names she had added during the past year. It was the only thing inside that building that couldn't be replaced. She ran inside at 11:12. The smoke had already descended into the first-floor hallway, thick and low. She bent down, but not low enough, and she managed to reach the desk and open the drawer. Benny found her about 30 feet from the exit, lying on her side with the notebook clutched in both hands against her chest. He carried her outside. August stood across the street, about 130 feet from the front entrance. 3 men had stopped him when he tried to run inside, and they had truly needed all their strength to hold him back. He stood there watching the flames lick through the second-floor window frames, watching the 4 machine-cut steel letters on the sign above the main entrance, his father's name, begin to blacken around the edges, and he understood, with perfect clarity and terrible calm, that this was the second time in his life he had stood outside a door he wasn't permitted to enter, while the person inside was alone. The first time, he had been 30 feet away. This time, 130. The fire engines arrived at 11:19. Meredith was placed inside an ambulance at 11:23. By 4 o'clock in the morning, the fire had been extinguished, and only smoke continued to rise from the second floor. On the opposite sidewalk, 19 men stood in small groups, every one of them looking toward a single person. They waited. For 10 years, whenever someone burned something that belonged to August Kroll, something else in the city would be burning by the following morning. That was how things worked, and every man standing there understood that system, and half of them were already prepared to do their part before anyone asked. Benny stepped closer. "Just say the word," he said quietly. August didn't take his eyes from the blackened sign. He stood there for a very long time, long enough for the sky above the eastern side of the river to begin changing color. Then he spoke. "Bring the car to the hospital." "And after that?" "There is no after that." Benny looked at him. "August, you heard me." And he gave no order. 3 days. Meredith lay on the 5th floor of Rhode Island Hospital, in the respiratory unit, room 409, breathing oxygen through a nasal cannula and sleeping most of the time because of the medication. The doctor said the damage to her airway was moderate and that she would make a full recovery, and that if she had remained inside for another 2 minutes, the answer would have been different. August sat in the hallway. No one stopped him. That was the first thing he noticed, though he told no one. That this time, there were no guards standing at the end of the corridor, no one trading shifts to avoid walking past where he sat, no special rules being enforced. A young nurse passed by, saw that he had been sitting there since the night before, and when she returned for her next shift, she brought him a paper cup of coffee. She placed it on the chair beside him and said, "Mrs. Voss is sleeping now, sir," then continued on her way. Her hand didn't tremble. August picked up the coffee and sat for a very long time without drinking it. On the morning of the 3rd day, Meredith opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling, at the intravenous stand, at the oxygen tubing running across her cheek, and it took her about 15 seconds to understand where she was and which side of her profession she was on. August had risen from his chair and was standing beside the bed. She turned her head toward him. Her voice was terribly hoarse, barely more than air, and she had to try twice before the words came out. He bent closer. "What happened to the other 4? August straightened. He didn't answer immediately. During the 3 days he had spent sitting in the hallway, he had prepared answers to about 7 questions he believed she would ask. Was the clinic still standing? Had the notebook survived? Who had done it? What was he going to do? What would happen next? He had built each answer in his mind, choosing every word, because he knew that what he said in this moment would determine everything that followed. He hadn't prepared for this question. "All 4 were outside before the smoke reached the 1st floor," he said. No one had to be admitted to the hospital. Mr. Duarte went home that same night. Meredith closed her eyes. She gave one very small nod, then fell asleep again. That was all she asked on the third day. Not one word about the building. Not one word about the notebook, which Benny had placed on the table beside her bed on the first night. Its cover curled from the heat and the edges of its pages yellowed, but all 142 names still intact. August went back into the hallway, walked to the far end, and stood before the window overlooking the parking lot. He remained there for nearly an hour. He had spent 34 years living in a world governed by very clear rules. If someone burned one thing that belonged to him, he had to burn two things that belonged to them, not out of hatred, but because it was the only way to keep a third thing from being burned. He understood that logic down to the bone. He had used it to keep hundreds of people alive for 10 years. But he had just heard a woman wake after 3 days of breathing through a tube, and ask about 4 people she had known for only a few days. And he understood something very simple that he had avoided facing for months. She couldn't live in his world. Not because she was weak, because she would always run back inside. A person like her would always go back. And in his world, someone who always went back had only one possible ending. The meeting took place 4 days later, in a room behind the offices of the transportation fleet near the harbor. 8 people were present. August sat at the head of the table. He spoke for 11 minutes without explaining his reasons, because in that room, people didn't ask for reasons. He laid out how everything would be divided. The entire harbor operation, the unions, and everything that came with them would pass to Benedict Saar. August would retain the transportation fleet and the 3 legally registered companies, and nothing else. The transfer would take effect on the first day of the following month. Then he removed the plain silver ring from his little finger. It was difficult to take off because he hadn't removed it in 10 years, and he had to twist it twice. He placed it on the wooden table and pushed it toward Benny. Benny looked at the ring. He didn't pick it up immediately. "You know what this means," he said. "I know. You know that from now on, I can't protect you anymore. I'm not permitted to. If something happens, and you're no longer a man of this house, then I have to deal with you the way I would deal with anyone else. That's the law. It isn't me. I know, Benny, because for the past 10 years, what had kept August Krall safe had never been the men standing beside him. What had kept him safe was the name. It was the understanding shared by everyone in the city that touching him would bring consequences, and that those consequences came from an organization, not from one man. The day he pushed the ring across the table, he pushed all of that away with it. Benny picked up the ring. He didn't place it on his little finger. He slipped it into his breast pocket. "My friend," he said. August told Meredith on the evening she was discharged, while they sat in the car and the streetlights began coming on along Broad Avenue. He told her everything, hiding no detail, including what Benny had said about the law. He was the only one who had heard it, and she was the only one who heard it. Meredith remained silent until the car turned onto Pine Street. "Are you afraid?" she asked. August kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Yes," he said. The building at 114 Ferris Street reopened in March of the following year, after 5 months of repairs, with 4 new steel letters on the sign and a fire alarm system that the insurance company required to be installed at 3 times the minimum standard. On a Saturday afternoon in May, August told her that he had business in Jamestown, a marina lease that needed to be signed, and asked whether she wanted to come along and see the road. Meredith went. They crossed the Jamestown Bridge close to 6 o'clock, and she realized immediately that there was no marina when he turned left at the intersection instead of right toward the harbor. He drove another 15 minutes, down a narrow road with grass growing between the 2 tire tracks, and stopped in the open ground before Beavertail Lighthouse. The wind there was so strong that she had to hold her hair with both hands when she stepped out. He opened the trunk. Inside was a foam cooler, 2 real porcelain plates instead of paper ones, a bottle of hard cider, bread from the bakery beneath the apartment, and a container of smoked salmon. He spread a cloth over the trunk lid and arranged everything on it. "Did you cook?" she asked. "No. After the soup incident, I'm not allowed to cook anymore." She laughed, and the wind carried half the sound away. The soup had happened in January. He had made fish soup for her after a long shift, following a recipe Fernanda recited over the phone, and at the final step, when she told him to add salt, he had poured in everything from the container, because he assumed that something so small must contain exactly the right amount. Meredith tasted 1 spoonful and sat perfectly still for 5 seconds. Then she put the spoon down and said it was the highest sodium concentration she had encountered in 6 years of nursing, delivering the sentence in precisely the same voice she used when reporting test results to a doctor, and he had laughed so hard that he had to brace one hand against the kitchen table. The cigarettes had been the story of February. He smoked outside the clinic entrance, hidden behind a lamppost, and believed she didn't know. She walked outside, stood beside him, and neither took the cigarette away nor lectured him. She said only one sentence. "I've watched 40 people die because of their lungs. Do you want to be number 41? Then she went back inside. He quit for 1 week out of irritation. Then he quit for good, because on the 8th day, he realized he didn't want to find out whether the list in the green-covered notebook had room for his name. They ate while the sun slowly sank over the bay. At around 7:30 August, set down his plate, and said nothing for a long time. And Meredith understood that this silence was different from all his others. "Say it," she said. "There are a few things I want to tell you first," he said. "I want to say them once. Say them properly, so you'll never have to hear them from someone else later." He looked out toward the sea. "I'm not a good man, Meredith. I'm not saying that so you can argue with me. I'm saying it because it's true. During the 10 years I stood in that position, I did things that, if I told you all of them now, would make you stand up, walk back to the main road, and find a ride home. And you would be right to do it. There are people who lost everything because of me. There are people who never went home because of me. I haven't killed anyone with my own hands in the past 7 years. But I know perfectly well that sentence means nothing, because I was the one who made the decisions, and I knew what I was deciding." Meredith said nothing. "I won't ask you to forgive me, because forgiveness isn't your responsibility. And I won't promise that I've become a different man, because I don't believe anyone changes that completely, and I don't want to tell you a single lie." He turned to look at her. "But there is one thing I can promise, and I can promise it because it's within my power." The wind fell still for one brief moment. "For the rest of your life, you'll never have to stand at another doorway waiting for someone to call your name." Meredith Voss raised one hand to cover her mouth. She had heard many promises in her life, and most of them had been grand, and not one of the people who made them had ever known about the 3 words she had waited for on the 4th step of a staircase, inside a house in Ashford Hollow, on a night of hail. She had never told anyone about it. He had been there. He had seen it. And for more than a year, he hadn't mentioned it once. Until now. August lowered himself onto one knee on the ground, covered with gravel and wild grass before Beavertail Lighthouse. The box he took from his coat pocket wasn't velvet. It was a small, worn tin box, the kind once used for rolling tobacco, and inside was a thin gold ring set with a very small blue stone. "It belonged to my mother," he said. "She died when I was 11. This was the only thing my father never pawned, not even during our hungriest year." Meredith cried. She cried and nodded, and she had to breathe in twice before she could speak aloud. "Yes," she said. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and added, her voice once again carrying the calm steadiness he always heard when she reported a patient's numbers to a doctor. "But I have a 4th condition." He was still kneeling. "Go on. You have to live a long life." She looked directly into his eyes. "I've sat beside too many people while they left, August. 142 of them. I remember every name. There's no room for your name in that notebook, and I won't write it there. Do you understand me?" August Crowell nodded. "Agreed," he said. Cordelia Thorne was 32 years old, and over the past 2 years she had submitted 14 applications. The recruitment company where she worked had gone through 2 rounds of layoffs, and she had survived both. But surviving inside a building that was growing emptier by the month felt no different from standing on the highest floor of something, slowly sinking into the earth. The house in Ashford Hollow had been sold the previous autumn, sold in haste, and after the bank was paid, the money left over was only enough for Rosalind and Cordelia to rent a 2-bedroom apartment in Pawtucket. The Human Resources Director position at Holloway Group paid twice what Cordelia was earning, and she applied because of the money, purely because of the money. But during the 3 weeks she spent preparing, another thought began growing beside that one, and she fed it. Holloway Group was the largest logistics corporation in New England, and its Human Resources Department had access to the shared background check databases used by medical contractors throughout the state. Meredith Voss's disciplinary record was there. A formal reprimand, 11 prescription forms, 18 months of probation, permanently recorded. Cordelia calculated that all it would take was 1 copy sent to the right reporter. The clinic on Ferris Street carried a strange name. Black cars were parked outside its doors, and its head nurse had once falsified opioid prescriptions. All anyone had to do was place those 3 lines beside one another. She didn't know who August Krall was. On the night of the hail, she had seen only a soaking wet delivery man sitting at the kitchen table, and during the 2 years that followed, she had never thought about him for more than 5 seconds at a time. On Tuesday morning, she arrived 42 minutes early. Halloway Group's headquarters stood on Dyer Street, 40 stories of glass. She remained across the street until she had finished her coffee, silently rehearsing her opening, rehearsing the 3 employee retention figures she intended to mention during the 4th minute, while inside her mind ran a single hurried current of thought that never slowed and never stopped. She crossed the street at 20 minutes to 9. Just before the front steps, an elderly man was struggling with a medicine container. He was about 70, wearing a fabric coat worn thin at the elbows and loose-fitting trousers, and his right hand was trembling. It wasn't trembling from the cold. It shook in a small, steady rhythm that never ceased. The lid came loose, and several white pills fell out, scattering across the wet sidewalk, one of them coming to rest beside the toe of her shoe. "Miss," he said, "could you pick those up for me? My hand doesn't listen to me anymore." Cordelia glanced at her watch. 18 minutes to 9. She had time. She knew she had time. But the current inside her mind was still moving. The 3 retention figures, the opening sentence, and beneath them all, the image of a copied disciplinary record being sent from an anonymous email address. Her trousers were ivory. The sidewalk was wet. "I'm sorry, sir," she said. "I have an interview." The old man bent down. "Of course." She went inside. She didn't look back. The interview took place on the 36th floor and lasted 50 minutes, and Cordelia Thorne performed extremely well. She spoke about compensation structures, employee retention in the logistics industry, and delivered her 3 figures precisely during the 4th minute. At one point, she made all 4 members of the panel laugh together. During the 51st minute, the door behind them opened. The man who entered was wearing the fabric coat worn thin at the elbows. "This is Mr. Hollis Bain," said the person seated in the center, and all 4 panel members rose, chairman of the board. Cordelia stood with them. The color drained slowly from her face, beginning at the top and moving downward. Mr. Bain sat in the chair at the end of the table. He placed both hands on its surface, and his right hand was still trembling in that same small, steady rhythm. "Miss Thorne," he said, "outside the entrance this morning I asked you for help. Sir, I want to make one thing clear, so you don't misunderstand later." He looked at her, and there was no triumph in his eyes, none of the things she had prepared herself to resist. "I wasn't testing you. I didn't arrange any of it. I have early-stage Parkinson's disease. I've hidden it from my own board for 11 months, and this morning I truly couldn't open that medicine container. I stood there for 15 minutes. You were the 9th person to walk past me." He folded his hands together. "That is the sad part, Miss Thorne. If it had been a test, at least it would have meant something." The rejection letter arrived the following afternoon. Cordelia sat in her car in the underground parking garage and read it 4 times, and she didn't cry because she had lost the job. That same week, Rosalind Thorne was admitted to St. Auberon Hospital with congestive heart failure, on the 3rd floor, in room 314. Meredith didn't hear the news from Cordelia. She learned because the auto clinic had been one of the hospital's referral partners since April, and Rosalind's name appeared on the morning patient list. Meredith came on the 1st day, then the 2nd, then the 3rd. She didn't hold Rosalind's hand. She checked the swelling in her legs, recorded her urine output, reminded the nurse on duty about the evening dose of diuretic medication, and answered 2 questions from the attending physician. Rosalind watched her do all of it, and said nothing for 3 days. On the 4th day, as Meredith folded the blanket at the foot of the bed, Rosalind finally spoke. "You came so I could see that you won, didn't you?" Meredith stopped. She looked at the woman lying in the bed, her platinum hair now damp and flattened against her forehead, no lipstick on her mouth, breathing 18 times a minute. Meredith waited for one word. Only one. It didn't come. "Sleep well, Rosalind," she said, and left the room. What Meredith didn't know was that Rosalind Thorne already knew. She had known since November of the previous year, when she called Narragansett Coastal Bank to ask why no one had come to foreclose on the house, and was told that the debt had been assigned to a third party that had made no demands. She asked for the name. They gave her the name of a transportation company. She investigated the company, and she sat for a very long time inside the 2-bedroom apartment in Pawtucket, understanding who the soaking wet man at her kitchen table had been on the night of the hail, understanding why she was still allowed to lie in a hospital bed covered by insurance, and understanding that she was indebted to the one person at whose feet she had thrown a ring of keys. On the 4th night, she called the nurse on duty and asked for an envelope. She died at 4:12 in the morning. The nurse recorded that she passed away in her sleep with no one beside her. Meredith received the call at 3:48. She dressed in 2 minutes, drove for 21 minutes, and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. She entered room 314 at 4:19 in the morning, 7 minutes too late. On the table beside the bed was an envelope bearing her name. Inside was the original will dated April 17th, 2019, witnessed by 2 people and notarized. The document Gerald Whitmarsh had kept inside his safe, and Rosalind had retrieved 2 weeks earlier. With it was a piece of paper bearing 3 lines in trembling handwriting. "I don't know how to apologize. I never learned. This is the only thing I can give back." Meredith Voss stood at the foot of the bed in the room where the machines had been turned off, holding the note in her hand, and she thought about the 142 names inside a green-covered notebook, and about how during 6 years of nursing, she had never allowed anyone to die alone when she had the power to prevent it. 7 minutes. Had she driven faster? Had she not stopped at the red light on the corner of Chalkstone Street? Had she slept in the hallway chair, as she so often had for other people? And the question that remained with her for the rest of her life wasn't whether Rosalind had deserved anyone beside her. The question was whether, somewhere deep inside herself where she couldn't bear to look, Meredith hadn't truly wanted to arrive in time during those 7 minutes. She would never know for certain. Cordelia reached the 3rd floor at 4:35 in the morning, her hair tied back in haste and her coat pulled onto the wrong arms. She walked the length of the corridor and stopped when she saw Meredith standing in the doorway of room 314, still holding a sheet of paper in one hand. She didn't ask. She looked at the open door, looked into the room where all the machines had been turned off, and she understood. Then her knees gave way. It wasn't a gesture. Her legs truly couldn't hold her, and she sank onto the hospital tile with one hand gripping the edge of a waiting room chair. Meredith walked toward her. "I stood there and watched you walk out into the hail," Cordelia said. Her voice broke in the middle. "I brought your suitcase down from the attic before you even got home. I tied the elastic cord around it. My mother told me to bring it down, and I did, and I didn't ask a single question." Meredith bent down, slipped one hand beneath Cordelia's elbow, and helped her stand. "Everyone makes mistakes," she said. "Not everyone learns from them." August stood at the far end of the corridor with his hands in the pockets of his coat. He had heard everything. When Cordelia passed him, she stopped and told him that she knew who he was now, that she knew who had purchased her mother's debt, and that she didn't know what to say. He looked at her for a moment. "I didn't help you because you cried," he said. 6 months later, on a Sunday morning in August, the auto clinic opened at 8 o'clock. In the waiting room, an elderly patient vomited beside the row of plastic chairs. A woman wearing a gray t-shirt and jeans came out of the supply room carrying a bucket of water and a cleaning cloth, knelt down, wiped the tile clean, emptied the bucket, washed her hands, then returned to the reception desk and wrote the next person's name in the ledger. No one in the waiting room that day knew who she was. She had come every Sunday morning for 22 weeks and hadn't once spoken her last name. That afternoon, her phone rang. "Mr. Bain at Holloway still has an open position," August said. "I spoke with him. He'll meet with you, but he promises nothing beyond that." Cordelia remained silent for a very long time on the other end of the line. "Why are you doing this?" "Because on a night of hail," he said, "someone gave me a chance I didn't deserve." They left Providence in the spring of the following year and moved to a coastal town south of the bay, a 20-minute drive from Beavertail Lighthouse. Dr. Wendell Ashcombe ran the auto clinic on Ferris Street, while Meredith remained its clinical supervisor and returned to the city 3 days each week. By the 3rd year, there were 2 more locations, one in Ward 3 and one in Pawtucket, and the same 4-letter name appeared on all 3 signs. Their daughter was born on an October morning, and they named her Juniper. August held her for the first time in the delivery room, and his hands trembled so badly that the nurse had to steady his elbows. "You're crying," Meredith said. You've signed contracts that kept people awake for an entire month." He looked down at the tiny face resting in his hands. "And this little girl, who weighs no more than a book, has completely defeated me." When Juniper was 5 years old, on a Saturday afternoon, she sat at the kitchen table with a box of crayons and drew a picture. In the picture was a house with a red roof, and in the middle of the house was a door standing wide open, and from the yard outside stretched a line of people walking inside, each person holding the hand of the one in front. August picked up the drawing. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. But why did you draw the door open?" Juniper looked up at her father with the expression of someone who had just been asked a question whose answer was far too obvious. "Because if the door is closed, people have to stand outside in the rain." August Krall couldn't say anything. He placed the drawing back on the table, and Meredith looked over from the sink, and the two of them gazed at each other across the kitchen, without either of them needing to speak. The following Sunday afternoon, they drove to Beavertail. Juniper ran ahead along the grassy path, the wind lifting her knitted hat from her head. Meredith and August walked behind her, hand in hand, in the exact place where he had lowered himself onto one knee many years earlier. "I still think about that night," he said. "I think one small act of kindness changed everything." "No." She tightened her hand around his. "Anyone can do one kind thing once. You stood beneath that shelter for 10 minutes, but I had been opening doors for people for 6 years before you came. Many years earlier, in a room on a palliative care ward, a dying patient had taken hold of Meredith Voss's wrist and asked her, 'You hold the hand of this entire hospital, so who holds yours?' That night, Meredith hadn't been able to answer. She never answered the question with words, because from that time forward, every evening when the clinic lights went dark and she stepped outside, there was always a hand waiting for her beyond the door, and that door never closed again. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone you believe may need to hear something warm tonight. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can listen to more compelling stories every day. How did Meredith and August's story make you feel, and which part of it stayed with you the most? Please leave a comment below. We truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video lasting health, happiness, and peace in every day of your life. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.